And we're incredibly lucky to be joined by Nancy Cook, Margarita Konayev, and Michael Kanin today for our conversation on the intersection between artificial intelligence and national security and foreign affairs. Thank you all for sharing your time and insight. We're very excited to have you. So everyone has access to their full bios online, but I did just want to highlight a few things from each of their very impressive resumes before we dive in. So our moderator today, Dr. Nancy Cook, comes to us from Arizona State University, where she's a professor in the Polytechnic School and leads the Center for Human Artificial Intelligence and Robot Teaming. She's held a number of impressive leadership roles, including chairing the Board on Human Systems Integration at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, as well as others. And she was also a member of the Air Force's Scientific Advisory Board from 2008 to 2012. Next up, our panelists. We have Dr. Margarita Konayev, who's a research fellow at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where she specializes in military applications of artificial intelligence and Russian military innovation more broadly. Her research has been featured in many highly respected publications, the list of which is too long to cite here. And before joining CSET, she held fellowships at the Modern War Institute at West Point, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and the University of Pennsylvania's Perry Waldhaus, as well as a senior principal role at Gartner. And last but certainly not least, we have Michael Kanin, who's played a really key role in shaping the Air Force's approach to emerging tech, including authoring its AI strategy and managing its integration efforts as the Air Force HQ AI co-chair, and currently as the Director of Operations for the partnership on AI between MIT and the Department of the Air Force. He was included on Forbes 2019 30 Under 30 list. And he recently released a book titled T-AI, which I've read and offers really accessible and informative insight into both the challenges and opportunities associated with AI in today's geopolitical landscape, which we'll learn a lot more about those challenges and opportunities during today's discussion. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Nancy, who will provide some brief context on AI to help ground our conversation before diving into the discussion with Mike and Rita. So thank you all again for being here, and take it away, Nancy.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and thanks for having me here. It's a really exciting panel that you've put together, and I look forward to it. I have 5 minutes to overview AI, and I think what I'd like to do is to tell you about my perspective on one of the biggest challenges in AI that often goes overlooked, and that is AI playing well with humans, AI being more or less a teammate to humans. And I know that many people don't consider that AI could even be a teammate because they define teammate as something inherently human. Well, I'm here to say that AI can be a good teammate because I use an analogy that you could have dogs as teammates in military working dog scenarios. And so just as dogs can be teammates, we might want to consider AI a teammate of a different species. But that being said, there's lots of challenges to get AI to play well with humans. Challenges that include, well, first of all, they need to have different roles and responsibilities than humans. AI should do what AI does best, humans should do what humans do best. But AI also, in order to be a good teammate, needs some social intelligence, some ability maybe to communicate, maybe not in natural language, but to communicate, to understand the intent of the human, to be trustworthy. And I think a lot of this will come up today to make decisions and take actions that we consider ethical and moral, and that's a big can of worms, to be explicable and to explain behavior, to be transparent. And those are all huge challenges for AI. I think that a lot of research needs to be done, and we're working on it in the center, and hope to be able to produce results that get thrown over the wall to people who are developing AI so that we can have AI that is human-friendly or human-centered. So that is my perspective on it, and I'm happy to talk to any of you about that more. But right now, let's get down to our panelists and questions. And the first question I have is for Michael. So Michael, as you highlighted in your recent book, Vladimir Putin equated AI superiority with global supremacy in 2017, stating that whoever becomes the leader in this sphere will become the ruler of the world. What do you think about that? Do you agree?
Well, first, thank you, Nancy, PCFR, Dr. Konayev, Nicole, by the way, the sponsors and the staff for the opportunity to share today, this series of talks and the issues you're raising for broad dialogue. I think that's what's most essential right now. And for everyone here, there are a lot of forks in the road ahead and decisions to be made, big ones. But they're easier and we'll do it right when there are venues like this, having the hard conversations out loud. So to begin with, you're taking us back to a really crucial place in the history of AI during the time from 17 to early January of 18. It'll be a time that makes its way into the history books. So what was happening then? What culminated in January of 18? Well, an errant ballistic missile warning was sent to Hawaii, of course, canceled about 38 minutes after that, thank goodness. In political headlines, Al Franken just resigned. In AI world, it was the first time that the Google CEO compared AI to electricity and fire, which is the right analogy to make. And they actually had just removed images of gorillas from its data labeling platform, sparking huge conversations on bias, fairness of AI in everyday dialogue. And it wasn't even commonly known that Google had partnered with the DoD on Project Maven, and some of employees had yet to even sign their open letter against that. By the way, not all employees, and certainly not the majority. 3.5 to 4 years ago feels like a lifetime. In the fast-paced world we live now in tech, it is a lifetime. But more than that, too, on January 3rd in 2018, news from Chairman Xi's New Year's address with a picture of even an AI book was strategically placed behind him. You see, this was just 4 months on the heels of Putin's infamous quote, but that quote is often misunderstood. Was it just some clairvoyant moment? Was he just offering commentary and forecast? I think it was a little bit beyond that. And this is what's often missed because we love to attribute some innate brilliance to Putin, which he's not. This was just a statement to other statesmen, a confirmation that he and his government were awake and they were aware to a sophisticatedly deep effort underway to accomplish what was viewed as a new world order. Because only a couple months before his words, China released its massive 3-part strategy aimed at achieving very clear benchmarks in the advances of AI. First, by 2020, that's over a year ago now, China would match the highest levels of AI tech and application capabilities. In 25, they intend to capture a verifiable lead on the production of core AI tech. And by 2030, they intend to dominate and lead all countries in the world in all aspects. To be the sole leader is what their goal is. With all this said, Putin was responsive in nature, but authoritarian leaders and countries did already recognize it was no longer defensible to incubate AI innovations for longer than the shortest time and to no longer slow walk efforts, but rollouts were what mattered. And this was a chance to leapfrog and seize market in ways unlike before. And while all of this was going on, the US was still weeks away from even coining the term great power competition, which was done in a strategy essentially meant to inform the decision-making in the 2018 to 2023 budgets. We were still collectively living under the guise that yesterday's requirements are the solutions to today's needs. And AI didn't wash ashore and still hasn't at the national level to have demand and understanding from broad citizenry. But that is happening in other countries and was then. So is the statement true? I don't know, maybe in the short term. Digital authoritarianism, a term not used enough, is incredibly effective, not good, but effective. Now remember, AI should be compared to electricity though, which means its range is equally across diplomatic spheres, economic, military, and information pillars of power. There are a lot of different games being played with new strategies that circumnavigate and cheat old rules and understood standards of the ways things always were. Putin's quote remains true in large part until we recognize, educate, understand, write new rules, quit fitting square pegs into round holes, but carve out new square pegs. So AI itself standalone? No. AI in concert and underpinning everything? Then yes, it's a very crucial arrow in our quiver because when you do it well, it means you have your proverbial house in order. AI is more like a journey than it is necessarily a discrete thing.
Thank you very much, Michael. I have one for you now, Rita. What are the most pressing challenges and opportunities for AI advancement within the national security and foreign policy contexts?
Thank you, Nancy, and thanks again for the opportunity to be here today. I'm grateful for the questions and looking forward to a discussion with the audience as well. When we're thinking about the most pressing challenges and opportunities, I think reflecting on what Mike has elaborated on, integration is going to be a key challenge. So what you started us today, Nancy, when you talked about whether AI can be a good teammate, this relationship between humans and machines is going to be essential. So much of the progress that we make in the gadgets and the playthings of AI is really not going to matter unless we're smart and deliberate and careful about the concept of integration and human machine teaming in particular. So that's one of the challenges. Whenever I talk about challenges, I talk about integration. I talk about the question of trust between humans and machines and how that is going to play out, whether, we talk about AI as a teammate, but can we trust that teammate, and what would it take for people to feel comfortable with using AI-enabled technologies, let alone using them in military settings or in security situations. Opportunities, there are also many, and it really depends on the sector. But for me personally, it's difficult to think about the opportunities unless there is a premeditated, careful approach to adoption and implementation in a way that is beneficial to all of society. Because we've seen what happens with digital technologies and disinformation, and we've seen what happens with cyber, and without thinking about cyber defenses and the damage that could be done through cyber attacks to critical infrastructure, when those technologies were being developed and integrated so deeply into society, if we were perhaps been much more careful and deliberate with what we regulate and what we allow, perhaps we would have been able to avoid or curtail some of the damage that's been done already and will continue to be made by some of these emerging technologies. So perhaps that is one of the biggest challenges, is to finding a responsible way to integrate AI into society, because one way or another, I think it will be integrated. But whether we are careful and deliberate about it is going to be a major challenge.
I definitely agree with that. Michael, do you have any challenges or opportunities that you can add?
I think nothing more than what Rita would have alluded to. Like many things, I'm quite bullish about the opportunities at hand, not always quite the same about how we get to those. And ultimately, the narrow and specific uses to which we ourselves put our machines will be where the problems arise and the solutions reside.
Okay, so Rita, back to you. Where does the United States stand in the global AI capability hierarchy today?
It seems like an easy, straightforward question, right? Just rank things and see where we are. But because AI is like electricity, fire, sun, love, death, whatever you choose to compare it to, because it's such a massive thing, it's really depends. So if the simple question is, in the hierarchy, yes, perhaps the United States still leads, with China as a close second. But when you start breaking it into component parts and sectors and applications and uses, then you're probably going to see much more variation. So for instance, if you at CSET, at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where I work, one of the analysis that we do is we look into research publications in the fields that are related to artificial intelligence around the world. And we do some sort of this kind of a bibliometric comparison to see which countries are publishing the most and which types of papers get the most citations. So the United States no longer publishes the most articles that are related to artificial intelligence. And that's in English language journals. So China has already out-published US scientists when it comes to artificial intelligence. At the same time, though, the articles themselves are not as heavily cited and they're not as impactful. So that's a question of quantity, perhaps, versus quality versus impact. Another area where you hear this conversation about hierarchy and who leads, who follows, who's left behind, in AI is the area of data. And there's this famous quote about how data is the new oil, and that means that China is the new Saudi Arabia because of the abundance of data that they have because of their surveillance capabilities and collection capabilities, and the fact that it's a massive country with a lot of people. But when you start breaking data into parts and you talk about type of data, quality of data, the ability to store that data, to label it, and what is that data for? What are you going to do with it? Then you start to see that the applications that can be derived from that data are still very much restricted to use within China and its markets where it has more influence. It's not the type of a global data that the United States has access to, and the type of labeled high quality data that the United States retains from its own population and its own companies. So just to, to kind of give the bottom line here is overall in many of the important metrics like investment and research quality, research impact, the United States does continue levels of innovation, the type of companies, the AI ecosystem in general. The United States is ahead, but I don't even necessarily think that that's the best way to think about it, because if we want to understand where AI is going to matter, we have to make these general questions much more specific. We should be talking about sectors, domains, particular applications, and make comparisons within those parameters as opposed to broad strokes. But that's not a straightforward answer, unfortunately.
Well, more specifically, talking about the US, what's your read on the Biden administration's approach to AI so far?
I think that they're off to a good start. They have a lot of good people at OSCP. I'm a little biased since they poached a lot of our people out of CSET, and they went to do the administration, and they're leading a lot of the efforts there. I like this new National AI Initiative Office, the fact that it has a vision for kind of a whole of government, eventually whole of society approach. I like that it thinks about AI beyond national defense to, the opportunities in AI that I remain somewhat reluctant about, but there is recent, this Endless Frontier Act that just passed, and the massive amount of money that is going to go to NIH. I think that's not NIH, NSF, sorry. I think that's wonderful. More money for research and development is always a good idea. So I think they're on the correct road, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there are no challenges. Yeah, and I think, Mike can speak more to what DoD is doing, but I was just recently reading the new memo from Kath Hicks on responsible AI. And one of the metrics there that they are emphasizing is trustworthy AI, the trust between humans and warfighters, machines and warfighters. And to me, that was one of the topics that we've been emphasizing in our research at CSET that I thought was really important. So that kind of clicked the box for me that they're thinking about it. So I think that within the Biden administration, there's a good understanding for the potential of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, the fact that you need to think about them much more broadly than their military applications, and that you kind of need all hands on deck to implement them effectively. But I think overall, and this is just a side note, as in like my thoughts and feelings, I don't necessarily fully on board with strategies and investments that are designed to outdo China. I think but that's a mind frame. That's a frame of mind. I think a lot of the conversation in tech right now, and in AI more specifically, is how are we doing vis-a-vis China? Are we spending more than China? Are we collecting more data than China? Are we, investing in our talent more than China? I think if that gets the gears going, fine, but I don't necessarily think that's the correct mindset for, the leader of the free world or a country that purports to be it. Yeah. But that's a side note.
So are you saying, just to clarify, that the Biden administration's approach is congruent with that?
No, I don't think that's necessarily just the Biden administration. I should have been more clear. I think that's the broader political environment right now. And building on the past 4 years, I don't see, at least in that regard, much of a change. If there's any sort of bipartisanship in DC right now, it is surrounding China. It is surrounding an approach to China. This is perhaps one of the few areas where you see bipartisanship and cooperation on both sides of the aisle moving forward. So I mean, it's good that things are getting done, but is this the necessarily correct frame of mind to approach American innovation and why American innovation is important? Is it only important when it's against somebody? So, but that's a loaded kind of pointless question in many ways, but as long as there is money and there's investment and there's an emphasis, that's a good thing, I think, is the bottom line.
Okay, thank you. And now back to you, Michael. The National Security Commission on AI's recently published report calls for America to reach a state of military AI readiness by 2025. Is that a feasible goal? What do you think?
It's an audacious one. I personally live by the glass half full, optimistically realist model of shoot for the stars, land in the clouds. So it's the right goal. We better be in a better place. And it's inspired a lot of action, but we also can't think we either failed or succeeded set to a timeline. So, stuff happens. Again, AI is a journey and not a thing. For the Department of Defense, it operates its budget in 5-year time horizons, partially for good reason. Predictability, accountability is good stewards. And because we build big, complex things, or at least in the past, those things mean victory. But in software and keeping up with the pace of change, it makes things tough when you're planning out 5 years in advance. So we'll be ready for AI by 25, I hope. Although the way to know is to ask what's characteristically different then. What is government and business and personal lives? What have we done pragmatically and practically to change to get beyond words? Because it's not hard to know what the DoD or government values or what it prioritizes. Simply look at the budget. It's not a secret. So I'll summarize the most recent defense appropriations bill for FY21 as relevant to this dialogue. The DoD allocated 3 times the money for aircraft, ship, vehicle, depot maintenance, and cyber, $38 billion to 10. 17 billion goes to fuel and 780 million goes to cloud. 13 billion went to 96 Joint Strike Fighters and 800 million went to AI and 450 million to 5G. Do those numbers sound right? Well, I guess that's what we have to ask. And if you want to be AI ready by 25, you have to ask those questions. Now look, if the vision is overmatch in physical combat and systems, overwhelming air, land, and sea power, then fine, we reap the seeds we sow. To a certain degree, at least we'd be marching forward to the same beat of the same drum. But we don't say things like that because I don't think anyone with a straight face says, yeah, that's the plan. It's far more nuanced, far more sophisticated. And I'm also not going to say we don't have to deal with legacy and aging equipment either. We need fuel to project power. But to what degree is the hard and needed conversation? We love to talk about the top of the proverbial stack, the cool stuff, Ender's Game, what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. But the building blocks are dwindling afterthoughts, continuously traded down, not being risk averse, but risk blind. So do not abandon all, hope ye who enter here, right? Dante's Inferno quote seems apropos, because there are changes happening. 52 billion to the semiconductor industry, amazing, that's the right idea. The DoD is in the process of launching the Computer Language Initiative, something I'm personally quite invested and proud of, in which we'll treat aptitude and proficiency in computer programming languages the same way we treat and reward human foreign languages, along with all that training to learn them. That's a good example, and there's much more going on. But to be ready by 25 means the nation has to be on board. AI is a mix of human capital, it's data. If a business doesn't have cloud, it's not doing AI. If it doesn't have data and enforce standards, AI won't work. It's hardware. If the computer in front of the employee, or in my case, the airman or space guardian is 10 years old, how could they use it? It's software, new software. and it's partnerships and renewed connective tissue with academia and the world's best tech companies. We desperately need their partnership, and things can't get in the way of that because those relationships are crucially valuable to national security outside of any other conversations or spats that might be going on. The point is AI takes all things robustly put together. So I'm grateful for the words. We made the call to action and created a requirement. Now it's time, beyond time, frankly, that we demand of each other to get results from there.
Okay, thank you. That's a really interesting summary too of the bill. Rita, when we're up against authoritarian states that exert a good deal of control over national industries and companies, do democracies even have the tools and flexibility to compete and win in AI?
This is interesting. One of my research assistants is writing a piece about perceptions and misperceptions of China. And what she's writing about is one of the most common misperceptions in the China studies world is that China can't innovate. All it does is copycat. And why? Because of its authoritarian, communist, repressive system. So you can't really have the type of innovations you see in the United States, where there's a lot of open exchanges, there's a variety of freedoms, then there's also the profit to be made from success. Because none of this is possible under a communist system, there's a commonly held perception that China can't innovate. At the same time, there is also a very commonly led perception that authoritarian regimes, because of their control over the private sector and because of their control over their own people, are going to outpace and outdo democratic countries where the private sector has a say in what it does and how it innovates, what kind of technologies it invests in, and whether it does or does not want to share them with the government. And because democracies presumably listen to their people. And if their people don't want to be investing in developing killer robots, then those democracies may be pressured not to. So these are logically inconsistent thoughts and misperceptions on both sides. I talk a lot about different cultures of innovation. China innovates in a Chinese way. Russia innovates in a Russian way. The United States and other democracies that are built on free markets, free exchange of ideas, innovate in their own ways. Attempting to replicate the Chinese model in the United States is going to, I don't know, futile at best, probably horrifically going to backfire. And for China to suddenly adopt free market ideas and open up its own society just because it's going to fuel innovation, also not going to happen, and probably not even on the docket. I think we need to be thinking about our own strengths and not necessarily in comparison to another country's strengths, because another country does what another country does, and another system allows for innovation and cultural factors and regime factors, bureaucracies, the way that they're designed, that's how it proceeds and develops. Democracies absolutely have the flexibility and the ability to lead in this space and to lead responsibly in ways that all of those opportunities that I'm personally reluctant about can manifest and can be socially responsible, profitable to the people that are behind the innovation, but also helpful to society more broadly. So I think that democracies have like endless potential, but it's a question of understanding how to work within the systems that we have and not trying to re-engineer them because there's another country over the horizon that seems to be doing much, much better. Also, it's worth remembering that the signaling out of authoritarian regimes is marketing. It's not, why do we trust everything that is being published from China about its own capabilities and innovation and accomplishments? I read a lot of articles that simply regurgitate what is being published in the Chinese or the Russian media. Come on. Obviously, there's an interest there to showcase. It's like you take 15 different pictures, but you post your best one on social media. You're not going to talk about everything else that is happening. You're not going to showcase your challenge. You're not going to discuss your challenges. You're not going to discuss the things that go wrong, because that's just not an open society, and it's not an open media, and it's not an open environment. And it's not in their interest to showcase that they're doing something that is less than, if anything. So I think we need to be taking with a grain of salt everything that we hear out of closed societies and authoritarian countries. And I think we need to be more attuned to our own strengths, and frankly, to areas that we don't do very well because of societal inequities and barriers to access. But that's my 2 cents here.
So just to follow on that and focusing on the United States, what do we need from the private sector to ensure that the US can develop AI at the speed of relevance for both military and non-military uses?
I think we need accountability and responsibility, and an understanding that profit can still be made in a responsible way, in a way that benefits societies rather than used as tools of repression and containment and suppression. I think, I don't know, it's easier said than done, but I also think that we tend to overhype the tension that exists between the private sector and Silicon Valley, or the tech giants in the US and the US government, while there is actually quite a lot of collaboration and there's a lot of shared interest that once again stem from the opportunity for profit. And there is a very long history in the United States of significant collaboration between the government and the tech sector. It used to be that, you know, it was the government that led in research and development. And because of the massive money that was spent as part of the Cold War and the space race and things like that, a lot of the Silicon Valley blossomed and bloomed. So I think it's worth remembering that there is a historical relationship here, and there is shared interest, and there is no reason. And that collaboration already exists. There's much more collaboration than there is necessarily all of these overhyped tensions that we described. Not to say that there aren't challenges, but they're not these like gaps and chasms that cannot be overcome.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to, I have one more question that I want to ask Michael, and then we'll turn it over to audience questions. And I see we have at least one person that I can see with their hand up. So Michael, looking at the rise of digital deep fakes in China's AI-enabled social credit system as just 2 examples, it's clear that AI could be used as a tool for misinformation and surveillance or repression in certain hands. So what role does AI play in both enabling and potentially counteracting these problematic use cases?
This is a nuanced question. It requires a nuanced answer. And to Rita's point, I'm fairly certain one night we all decided on this. The tagline is you can't out China China. That is an important like banner thing we all have to remember. So back to the question. What we're talking about here is AI's inherent duality. What I mean by that is we have to worry about how to regulate and control it the right way. Most importantly, pay attention how it's used. It's a powerful tool, but historically, in our past, powerful tools were in the hands or only accessed by a few. Ones that I mean could compromise, hurt, and disenfranchise people, but also could benefit the many. So a nuke, for example, well, it's pretty tough to go to the first chain reaction under University of Chicago, which by the way, that's where that happened, or steal it from an underground facility in Tennessee, or even get the fissile material. But here's my point here. I'm not comparing it to nukes necessarily. I'm comparing the process. As a nation, we allow research to do its thing. Advance the science, chart the unknown, discover new, and that's not so much regulated or oversaw, but this technology, the research for, the results of, and how it's all done is open. It's available for good reason, sometimes though with not so great consequences. and it's an inherent duality. Where do we see this? Deepfakes, as you mentioned, are something we talk about often. In fact, a few weeks back, I don't know if people saw it, there's an ability that many were using to make portraits of who had passed become living in the picture again with head movements, smiles, and all the rest. Essentially, take a loved one and bring them back to life in a picture as it was marketed, which is a wholly separate conversation on right or wrong. But I took it as, wow, I can finally have that living Harry Potter Hogwarts portrait I always wanted to have. And in the matter of just a few moments, myself and anyone else could breathe pretend life into a picture with the click of a button. It's a deep fake. Anyways, what I'm trying to showcase here is the level of accessibility to the technology, because at a technical level, it's quite a feat. And the research community largely drove that. The underlying techniques used to make a deep fake are really advanced, and they've been democratized to all. And why would people do that? Well, deepfakes are the leading technique and in use to detect, for instance, breast cancer and mammograms, which is great. That's pretty awesome for society. It's why we science. Though we know that deepfakes create mis and disinformation, just depends on how you use the algorithm, which, mathematical techniques, right? And formulas. Or what about if I told you the leading team play and strategy algorithms are in a subset of techniques called reinforcement learning, happening in many AI advancements in games. And sometimes those games, or the ones now, are literally openly available, real-time strategy, top-down look, even with the fog of war games, like what your kids play on StarCraft and Dota. It's a very cool advancement. The science and research must move forward freely with creativity from the best minds, but it's all digital now and available to everyone. So dealing with this in an informed way, a thoughtful one, is what I think we need to worry about. And much of the time, something that has AI on it, think maybe a cyber offensive tool, needs AI to respond, machines at machine speed. They can be used for good, they can counteract bad, they can do bad, and advance science all in the same moment. So it's a brave new world if we're going to deal with the compromise and opportunities ahead. And we have to reimagine who's informed and expect that of not only your government, but neighbors, loved ones, friends, representatives, teachers, and ourselves, that we're at least informed and at least generally aware in everyday terms. And frankly, this was the inspiration for writing T-minus AI, so we could at least answer or imagine the answer to this very question.
Well, thank you. And thank you both. This has been really eye-opening for me. I've learned a lot, but I want to turn it over now to the audience to ask questions. And I see that Luke Wentz has his hand up.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Dr. Cook, and thanks, Michael and Rita, for being with us. One important aspect of our national security is our economic security, both in the micro and in the macro. With increases in AI, in some ways really depleting the need for more labor-intensive jobs in the workforce, we've seen economic solutions such as the universal basic income, which was obviously championed, really magnified by Andrew Yang, introduced to help curb some of the supply and demand employment gap problems, where Ford no longer needs people on assembly lines, trucks no longer need drivers, restaurants no longer need servers, etc. Where in contrast, others perhaps feel that AI creates the conditions for more innovation in our community, where we can expand and advance more exponentially. Would love to hear kind of your thoughts on whether there is a need for a UBI or universal basic income, or other, I guess, structural economic changes to really meet the needs created by AI.
I'll take a hack, Rita. I gotcha. Okay, this is. Imagine this. We have massive companies, and I am personally a proponent of this notion that if AI can take your job, that job was a task, it wasn't a job, and we need to do better by people. I mean, that is the current state of the technology, right? They're tasks. That's not to say that these aren't people's livelihoods and we need to pay attention to them. The idea, though, that we can upend an entire industry, think about like tax accounting, right? We can put TurboTax available to the entire world on a single software platform that's run by not very many people, and we can upend an entire, what was once upper middle class life, right? From one fell swoop of a piece of software, and then one group owns that. Is it a universal basic income to deal with that offset? I'm not sure, but there has to be something in place, because those people weren't in control of that, which is why we're kind of, why I'm so I wouldn't even say like such a proponent on this notion of upending all education right now. The only place where we're going to have reasonable education on artificial intelligence, and I'm going to put this in the sphere of something even deeper than, you know, I'd rather have charter schools and private whatever, I don't care. The only place that a demand for this stuff is going to come from is from the government. We did this once before with the National Defense Education Act in 1958, right? $1 billion in 1958 dollars back into the system, responding to a Sputnik moment that 10 years later, because we were asleep at the wheel as a nation then to new technology, took us to the moon and wins the space race. I think we're in that frame right now. So is it a universal basic income? Is it a way to do education better? Probably a mix of all those things. And then lastly, for what it's worth, nobody would have imagined that graphic designer, a video game maker, software engineer would have ever existed not that long ago. I don't think this is that much different. Maybe if anything, we can get humans out of task-oriented things. It's good they're not in factories in a lot of ways because things were dangerous. And that goes to the human machine teaming concepts that were really important, Nancy mentioned earlier.
Okay, let me take one that's in the chat. And this is a fairly general one, so I think it could be for either of you. From Ayush, what are the consequences of an over-reliance on AI?
Go ahead, Rita.
No, I think there's, you know, again, when we're talking about AI as a teammate and human machine teaming, there are two sides to the story, right? One of them is under trust and under reliance. So in situations where increased autonomy and AI can be helpful and useful and quick and process things much faster and maybe make more accurate decisions in ways that can make things more efficient, safer, and whatnot, there's a price to be paid for underuse and misuse. But there are also obviously consequences to over-reliance, and it's this tendency to, I think, it's a complacency that develops from using technologies, especially reliable technologies. I think for those of us in the audience who can go back long enough to remember life before GPS and driving before GPS, and then transitioning to printing your your directions to go somewhere, and now it's not even something that we think twice about. I think our phones tell us exactly where to go, when, how, quickly. Like, I live in a building where we don't have keys. All of my doors in the building are operated by our phones. I don't know what's going to happen if this thing runs out of battery. That's an example of over-reliance. I think if we begin to implement these technologies on a broad societal scale without any sort of backup or any sort of like contingency, I can call our concierge, but what happens when whoever is flying the plane on autopilot, increasingly autonomous pilot, just doesn't have the memory or the the skills anymore to remember how to use and how to operate whatever it is, the machinery that he believes or she believes that can do things on its own right now. So there are significant dangers there that are physical and mental and human in many basic ways.
I'll just two-cent this. I am an analog music fan because analog music is better because it doesn't approximate the sound wave with ones and zeros. Sometimes analog solutions are the best solutions and counteract digital things. And most of the time, digital things are better because we don't want to use those analog solutions. So we can't over rely on it because you can be fooled. But if you under rely on it, the world's just going to pass you by.
Okay, great. I wonder if we'll someday forget how to drive our own cars. So that's part of over-reliance. I see that Robert has his hand up.
Ultimately, AI is highly dependent upon computing power. Do you have any comments regarding where the United States stands in quantum computing, which is certainly going to dramatically impact the competencies of AI and everything else in this world. But where does the United States stand in that?
The United States stand like they stand in many technologies. It's a great question, Robert. That it depends on which part of the sector that you're talking about. When it comes to quantum computing, each company and the ways in which we can use different techniques to accomplish it are all very different. Everyone's betting on slightly different approaches to make something that is actually practicable. Because outside of very, very, very tough math equations and perhaps in predicting some material sciences and things, quantum computing has no real application in the world, and you're not seeing machine learning being written on it. Now, they stand also in a very recursively meta inform one another in different ways, because the things that we're learning in quantum mechanics right now and its application in quantum computing are being driven by advances in machine learning in order to understand the sciences a bit better. So as it stands right now, they're separate, but they're being informed by one another. And you know, people always wonder, like, how would I ever carry around a quantum computer? And you know, we've figured out how to cool things down that are really hot, like that computer in front of you right now. And maybe we'll figure out how to keep things very, very cold one day.
Okay, let me take another one that's in from the chat. Do you feel that there should be an international rules or treaties to govern AI similar to treaties on the proliferation of nuclear weapons? This one's from Sophia.
Dr. Konayev probably has some good outlook on this.
I can try. That's a good question, Sophia. And I think it goes back to the broader conversation of what is AI and where is it going to be used. AI is not a weapon, so it cannot be regulated in the same way that, you know, one of the most successful arms treaties that exist is the landmine treaty that prohibits the use of anti-human landmines. But that's a weapon. That's a much easier thing to regulate, and you can agree on the fact that a landmine is a weapon. Is AI that pilots a drone that is only used for surveillance a weapon? But what if that drone then has the capabilities to, you know, what if it's an armed drone? Is that a weapon then? That's a change that happened to the drone itself. It's not a change that happened to the AI. So at what point does AI become the weapon? I think there's a conversations right now within the United Nations as part of the efforts to, I wouldn't even call it regulate or negotiate, because it's been at a stage of discussing what we're going to discuss for the last 5 years, if not longer. That's a conversation about lethal autonomous weapons and regulating them. AI will obviously can and likely play a factor in enabling greater autonomy in lethal weapons and lethal systems, for sure. But the way that those weapons are currently being described right now and being defined right now, A, they don't exist. B, it really is debatable whether they are useful for anybody, and what is the utility in developing weapons you can't control and can't recall and can't establish accountability and responsibility for. So I think there has to be a conversation about setting standards around the use of AI, and that's a conversation that has to be had at all levels, from the local, like city levels, to state levels, to federal, international, a whole slew of like people and different types of people and institutions involved in the conversations around standards for AI, both technical and ethical. But an international regulation, international arms treaty on AI seems difficult. Also, arms control treaties are kind of out of fashion right now. So it's a different political environment. I mean, it depends. I'm not necessarily sure where it's going to go, but right now there doesn't seem to be a lot of support for international arms control treaties in general.
Thank you, Rita. Let me take one more, and then I think we're going to have to be wrapping up pretty soon. So this is from Bethany. The House recently passed a Cyber Diplomacy Act, paving the way for a new Bureau of International Cyberspace Policy to be established at the State Department. Do you envision a similar bureau being established to address AI use cases? I think this is similar to the question you just answered, Rita.
No, I think that actually might work better than an attempt to control, to establish an international arms control agreement. This is use cases allows you the ability to, find common ground with other countries and find areas where everybody should have an interest in imposing certain regulations, whether it's to avoid accidents, whether it's to prevent bias, or increase privacy, increase transparency. And there's a lot of common ground, especially between democratic countries and free countries, in the ethical standards around AI and the privacy preserving technology that should be, adopted as we're progressing towards the societal implementation of AI or whatnot. So I think something like that is much more viable and smarter than an arms control attempt at artificial intelligence.
Okay, thank you. I guess I'll give you a chance to say any last comments that you want to make. I've come away from this feeling more optimistic than I did going into it. I think the problem is very nuanced. AI is not monolithic. There's many different applications and domains. I think I take away that we need to just start focusing on the United States and stop worrying about China and others and invest in education. So that's my takeaway. So Michael, do you want to, any last wrap up comments?
Yeah, and if anyone has any, I'll stay on for another couple minutes if anyone wants any rapid fire things, if the window's still up. But ultimately, this is a bit of a call for action. And if there wasn't a single advancement today, AI will still profoundly impact human opportunity experience. And in addition to that, just think about this. The US is about to graduate 50,000 people with STEM-like degrees for 500,000 open jobs. We live in a world where the barriers to education have never been lower. You shouldn't care if someone has a college degree or not. Have you done it? Can you do it? Do you have a passion to learn it? How do we as a nation help drive down the gap is what matters, because in a few short years, that jumps up to 1 million. And we need to also reimagine who fills this job space and what does STEM mean, which looks a little bit more like STEAM, add in an A for the arts. So it's 2021. The digital divide still separates us, our youth from education, and our urban and rural communities from opportunity have more in common than they might think. And these technologies are infringing on human rights across the globe, yet society doesn't talk about it, or at least to the extent that we're generally aware of conflicts and compromises moving forward. But we can all influence the path and provide opportunity for others, like our kids and friends and neighbors. And mark these words: the future rock stars in tech, they'll be teachers, sociologists, dancers, artists, psychologists, parents, and many more. So we should ask ourselves, what are you doing to better understand and help others do the same in ways that matter to them? Do you love dance? Help someone dance with a robot. Are you a writer? Show them how a language transformer works and can write language. Are you a psychologist? Help us deal with how people would handle life change, like losing jobs driven by tech. Are you in wildlife or nature preservation? Let's use computer vision to track and predict lions migrating across the savannah. Are you a political representative? Help us bridge the digital divide and present technology to more people. The point is, AI is for everyone and it has a place for everyone. And I hope that's the big takeaway from my end.
Thank you. And Rita?
Oh, well, that's a really hard one to follow, but I'll just, the small addition to that is that critical thinking skills and an understanding of how innovation and technological progress impact society is more important now than ever. So if you have students, if you have kids, if you have any young people you're invested in, sure, they should have basic STEM skills, but I am just as interested in somebody who could have very basically anticipated that connecting the world through technology could also backfire. And all you needed was somebody with a basic political science training or sociology training, or somebody who's literally taken intro to sociology or civics in high school to stop and think about what the integration of these technologies and capabilities is going to do to people relationships before we even begin talking about people to machine relationships. So 2 thumbs up for investments in STEM, but let's also remember that people and people skills are quite fundamental here when looking ahead.
Okay, well, I want to thank the organizers and let me turn it back over to Andrew.
Actually, this is Nicole. I'll hop in and just say another big thank you to everyone on the line for joining in, and especially to Rita, Mike, and Nancy for your insight and such a fascinating discussion. We really appreciate your time. And for everyone on the line, if you're interested in joining any upcoming PCFR events, please visit the website and register, and hopefully see you all soon at another event. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
Thank you.